Despite their reputation as the largest and best-funded foreign intelligence service in the world, the CIA's early history was defined by playing catch-up to other major powers.
When I was a cadet, what's the cadet motto at West Point? You will not lie, cheat, or steal, or tolerate those who do. I was the CIA director. We lied, we cheated, we stole.
I'm not sure that we can trust our government. Everything that the CIA has told us has been a lie, and it doesn't matter who's in the White House.
I'll never apologize for the United States of America. Ever. I don't care what the facts are.
Until their entrance into the Second World War, the US's foreign intelligence was conducted through a selection of Army, Navy, and government intelligence services. They rarely talked to each other, keeping their information separate and out of reach of the central government. It wasn't until 1942 that they were consolidated by President Roosevelt into one unified system, the OSS. Now, they had a lot of ground to cover, as the UK was already starting their foreign intelligence service over 30 years prior in 1908, and the Soviets were renowned for their massive network of informants and moles. So they needed every advantage to level the playing field, and some of the OSS thought that this would lie in testing and creating new interrogation techniques. Just a year after being created, the OSS was already conducting experiments to this end. Previously confidential documents reveal that as early as 1943, the OSS were giving military volunteers mescaline and other psychoactive drugs, all so that they could test their usage in interrogation. And it wasn't just volunteers though, the documents also make reference to involuntary testing on criminals using similar substances. At the same time, the OSS was working with mafia kingpins in New York in preparation for their invasion of Italy, so this was most likely the source for their test subjects. The OSS were the only branch of the US government involved in unethical experiments. The war effort gave the US a lot of new problems to solve. Don't you ever jump into your mesh and wonder, what's it all about? Where am I headed? Well, the answer is the League Divisions. Mech Arena is free to play and super easy to get into, and there are a few things you can do straight away so that you really see what the game has to offer. The first thing to do is to progress to Division 9 in Mech Arena, to unlock additional game modes like tournaments, 5v5 deathmatch, and a free-for-all mode. Divisions are achieved by winning matches and earning ranking points. Initially, the only available mode is the Control Point Clash, a cooperative game mode where teams capture points and defeat opponents to gain ranking points. To start, select Battle, then Quick Match, and if you're having trouble winning, enhance your matches and weapons using the free crates you receive, containing credits and blueprints to boost your squad's power. And then unlock more slots in your hangar for more matches per battle, which results in you getting more points. However, the key to all of this is experience, so you have to keep playing and learning. And Control Point Clash is so much fun. It's a 5v5 mode, where you team up and capture and control points. And every time you capture a point, this increases your team's influence counter, with more points accelerating the process. A team then wins by reaching 100 influence, eliminating all opposing matches, or having the highest influence after the 5-minute timer ends. And recently Mech Arena has just announced new skins for free via gameplay, and later in the month they're introducing an epic sci-fi themed event, bringing spectacular new maps, the Chain Gun Scorpius, and a new heavy juicer pilot with an awesome unique look. It's completely free to play on Android and iOS right now, and you can use my personal link or scan my QR code to get bonuses worth $30. We're talking about 1 skin, 1 Prodigy crate, and 5,000 credits to help kickstart your game. So don't wait around, click the link in the description below. One of which was malaria. Sending thousands of soldiers who had probably never left their country into the Pacific led to a massive malaria problem. And quinine, one of the most effective treatments, was nearly all controlled by the Japanese. Now, to be fair, not many soldiers did die from the less aggressive eastern strain, but the amount of people who left in hospital beds was a huge drain on the military. Desperate for new treatments, the US Army and the State Department funded dangerous tests of new malaria treatments on inmates at Stateville Penitentiary, Illinois. Incentivized by meager sums of cash or early parole, 500 prisoners were infected with malaria and given the untested drugs. They knew many of these compounds and mixtures were dangerous and fatal in high doses, but they wanted to test the upper limits of what someone can actually take. One prisoner died after a particularly high dose of one of these research chemicals, and many others suffered awfully from the treatments. They even started getting some of the prisoners involved in the research process itself. One imprisoned murderer was instrumental in recruiting other prisoners, observing the results and even conducting the tests. Now, despite these experiments becoming public knowledge a few years later, the CIA was going to learn a lot from these early government endeavors into human experimentation. In particular, these techniques of interrogating test subjects into the experiment itself is something that the CIA would be soon to take advantage of. But eventually, once the war was over, the OSS had time to consolidate and rebuild, and it was around 1947 that the CIA was born, a new agency designed to make up for the inadequacies of the OSS. Some of their early aims were to hone and perfect the art of interrogation. But why interrogation?
Panic began to set in. And I know what they mean now when they say everyone has a breaking point, a point at which you will basically say anything just to make it stop.
The OSS and other intelligence services were interested in solving a problem that had existed for thousands of years. It barely ever works. It wasn't that people wouldn't talk, it was that they talked too much. People would say anything under enough pressure, so getting them to tell the truth is a whole other matter entirely, and this was the holy grail the OSS was after. They had 4 main goals. The first, as we've already mentioned, was to find a way to get the truth out of prisoners, but they were also looking to condition their own agents against interrogation, to ensure their own techniques couldn't be used against them. The other 2 aims, though, are much more unsettling. They mentioned finding out methods of controlling the activities of prisoners and people within their control, but also of conditioning their own agents against it. Behind the deliberately vague phrasing, they're referring to mind control, and this was something the CIA was incredibly interested in.
Are you aware of Operation Midnight Climax?
Those were the safe houses in San Francisco.
Well, that was the brothel version of it.
Yeah.
Where they lured these Johns into these brothels and then dosed them up with LSD and studied them.
In 1955, one of the CIA's darkest experiments would begin in San Francisco. As part of the CIA's multitude of experiments under the wing of MKUltra, one mind control experiment was especially disturbing, a top secret program called Operation Midnight Climax. Now, the operation began with the CIA purchasing an apartment in San Francisco and transforming this place into a makeshift brothel. A brothel wired up to recording units, martini booths, toilets, and one-way and two-way mirrors. Next, the CIA sent undercover agents to go out and hire random sex workers. Soon after, the CIA would then blackmail these prostitutes, whilst also providing favors for these sex workers. Favors like criminal immunity and huge wads of cash. And in return, the prostitutes would lure unknowing men into the CIA's experiment. In the first brothel, prostitute informants would administer psychoactive drugs to unsuspecting clients. According to the journalist Gary Kamiya, certain individuals, the prostitutes, would covertly administer this material in accordance with the CIA's instructions, with one of the agents telling the Telegraph Hill that you could bring people in for quickies after lunch. So over time, once the brothel was set up, hundreds of men and prostitutes would be put into the rooms throughout the city, and in these rooms, the CIA operatives would be hiding within these walls, behind a two-way or one-way mirror, watching everything that happened in the room. And then eventually, prostitutes would be secretly instructed by these operatives to go to the bathroom. Then the next minute, the men waiting around in the bed would be unknowingly drugged with LSD, sprayed by aerosols, or had their drinks spiked, which when combined with the women and blackmail, made the men especially willing to divulge their deepest secrets, because this was the ultimate aim of the operation. It was a test to see how open and talkative drugs and sex made these men. How could they manipulate someone's mind to tell someone their darkest secrets? The escorts would then stay with these men for hours, talking them up and asking them about their jobs, and the men just couldn't stop talking. And it was this operation that showed a lot of hope for the CIA's quest in mind control, so much so that they would actually open up a second brothel next to the Golden Gate Bridge. However, over the following years, moral questions started to be raised, and the considerable risks that came from this operation in terms of negative publicity and trust in the public added extra pressure for there to be measurable results from these experiments. But unfortunately for the CIA, they were forced to admit that this method of mind control really wasn't providing enough reliable data to be of any real use for the CIA's mind control ambitions. And so eventually the operation would come to an end, and all records would be destroyed by the CIA in 1973. In fact, the only reason we know any of this is because of a whistleblower who worked for the US State Department, as he remembered that the CIA had actually stored records of this top secret operation in a warehouse, and these records only detailed the financial records of the operation, showing how much the prostitutes were paid, along with the cost of operating the San Francisco brothels. But by understanding the finances of this operation, the whistleblower could piece together the story again. And that's why after the whistleblower testified this information to Congress, he would eventually write a book about MKUltra, one of the first to expose the CIA's many crimes. But it was after becoming one of the main voices, speaking out against the CIA's mind control experiments, that the whistleblower would eventually find the true damage of these operations. Because according to Tom O'Neill, the reason this whistleblower faded into obscurity and stopped speaking out against the CIA's secret experiments was because thousands of people every day would camp out in his garden, constantly claiming that they were victims of the CIA's MKUltra operations. Every day, hundreds of people would find the whistleblower, convinced that the CIA had done something to them, that they were also victims of MKUltra. And it was after this that it became clear that operations like Midnight Climax were sowing some very deep seeds of mistrust against the entire US government across the country. Lots of the victims were left with invisible scars, results of the CIA's tampering within their minds. However, in most people, it manifested as anxiety, depression, and PTSD. Some people were lost forever, their personalities forever changed. In a few cases, it turned people into radicals, people like the Unabomber Ted Kaczynski. You see, before he came to university, he was a genius. So much so showed that he was on the borderline of madness, as he too was exposed to psychic driving, continual humiliation, and other CIA mind control techniques, explaining his later hatred of authority, considering what the CIA had done to this underage Ted Kaczynski. But of all the killers that the CIA is linked to, none are more disturbing than their connection with Charles Manson. Infamous for his cult of followers who call themselves the Family, he was arrested and imprisoned for masterminding the ritualistic murders of Sharon Tate and 6 others. Now all signs seem to point to a deluded attempt to spark a race war, but now the official narrative is beginning to fall apart, as it's only recently that the CIA's likely involvement has been uncovered, all based on decades of work by one man, Tom O'Neill. You see, the year was 1999, and Tom was just an entertainment journalist. He'd been out of work for some time, until eventually an offer came from an editor at the Premier magazine, asking him to write a piece on the Manson murders in preparation for the 30th anniversary. Tom almost didn't accept. Everyone already knew the story, so what else was there to uncover? But he needed the money, and the magazine's editor was sure there was something else to the story. Little did she know how right she would be. The 3-month deadline set by the magazine came and went, but Tom didn't care. What began as a short project became an obsession. Every new discovery just led to more questions.
Well, a real turning point in my reporting was after I got access to Manson's parole file and saw that, in Helter Skelter, Bugliosi, I think, describes 2 arrests that Manson got released on technicalities, shoddy police work or something, when he should have been violated. But what he didn't do was talk about 3 or 4 more.
Turning a short piece on Manson into an entire book that still doesn't answer all the questions. The only thing that became crystal clear was the official narrative of the Manson family just didn't add up. And here's what he learned. The first thing that Tom discovered was that the trial of Charles Manson and the fact that one of the prosecutor's key witnesses lied in court about the motive of the murder, and that lie became part of the official story, and was set in stone in the chief prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi's best-selling book a few years later. Both him and the witness alleged that Charles Manson chose the Tate's house as the location because the former resident, Terry Melcher, had wronged Manson in the past over some record deal, but the official motive was that Manson wanted to start a quote race war, which this has absolutely no link to. Tom's suspicions then grew further when he interviewed other people surrounding the case, who nearly all hated Bugliosi and thought that he was a snake. Working from this clue of a nonsensical motive and a possibly corrupt prosecution, Tom uncovered a hidden depth to the relationship between Melcher, one of the top record producers of the 60s, and Manson. He uncovered that Melcher had visited Manson's cult at their desert compound after the murders took place, and that he had lied under oath during the murder trial, something that can actually lead you to getting a murder sentence yourself for lying in a murder trial. Documents also uncovered by Tom implied that Melcher had schemed with Bugliosi to include this lie in his theory, which soon became fact. When Bugliosi himself was interviewed by Tom, who was showing him the evidence and the accusations, Bugliosi started to panic. He clamped up, deftly brushing aside Tom's questions using his decades of experience as a courtroom lawyer. And then, he even threatened to sue Tom for $100 million. However, his co-prosecutor on the Manson case, Stephen Kay, was much less combative when he was confronted. And he also told Tom that his evidence could overturn the whole verdict, possibly setting Manson the crazed murderer free. But Tom pressed on. There were just too many questions. Why Bugliosi and Melcher lied about the motive? What were they covering up this whole time? And that's when the CIA and their involvement came into focus. Because by 2005, Tom was deeply stuck into the mystery, as he uncovered another link to Charles Manson, this time stemming from a man called Reeve Whitson. He had been an undercover agent for the CIA, working on infiltrating hippie groups and the film industry in the 60s. At least, that's what Reeve's wife and child thought. The CIA coyly told Tom that they could neither confirm nor deny his employment. But shortly after his death, Reeves had confessed to his family that he had been involved with the Manson family under the orders of the CIA, and that he could have actually stopped the murders, but he didn't. In fact, he had actually been at the scene of the crime before the police even showed up, which was a deal later corroborated by witnesses. And it's at this point this particular thread of inquiry transitions from evidence to speculation. Although it's not hard to put together the pieces of the puzzle, Reeves' involvement with the Mansons was likely under Operation Chaos, a massive project that involved missions to destabilize left-wing groups and civil rights movements. One part of the tragic legacy of the Manson murders is that it finally destroyed the optimism and spirit of the 60s. The days of the summer of love died, and if the CIA were involved, then their plan worked spectacularly. Other details that Tom uncovered also offer circumstantial evidence to this theory. Before the murders occurred, for example, Manson was caught with his cult, breaking parole, and in possession of stolen cars, credit cards, and even a machine gun. He would have been rearrested if he were anyone else, but his parole officer somehow pulled out every stopped to let him go free after receiving a message from higher-ups in the chain of command. And Manson is also strongly linked to the CIA's LSD mind control program MKUltra. During 1967, when Manson was forming his cult in San Francisco before they moved to California, he allegedly came into contact with Dr. Louis West. He had been a part of MKUltra for years, running various experiments involving LSD on unsuspecting victims, and it's highly plausible that Manson had been one of the experimentees, or had even been involved with the running of the test themselves, as his followers did accomplish one of MKUltra's holy grails, using LSD and psychological pressure to convince that person to kill. However, proof for these specific allegations, much like the majority of the details surrounding the case, have likely been lost forever. Despite this, it's still clear that the truth never really came out, because the further you go down this rabbit hole, the more absurd and unbelievable the story becomes. Manson himself, for example, plays the part of the crazed lunatic on camera, but speaks in full sentences in clear English when he's not being interviewed by the press. And I only have time here to scratch the surface. Tom O'Neill spent 20 years diving into the case and still hasn't reached the bottom of it. Although his brilliant book Chaos: Charles Manson, the CIA and the Secret History of the 60s goes into far more detail on the intricacies of the cover-up. Mind control, brainwashing, psychic driving. We've seen some pretty impressive technology, but not all of the CIA's experiments and tests have worked perfectly. In fact, some were so nonsensical and silly that it's even a wonder that they made it past the drawing board. And lots of these stupid schemes involve the use of animals in one way or another. I mean, just take the CIA's quite literal solution to the dead drop problem. Agents needed a way to transfer important messages or documents without seeing each other. So the storage method had to be something so normal it wouldn't be noticed, or so disgusting it wouldn't be touched. So the agents had the bright idea to create dead rats with a secret storage compartment hidden in their hollowed out carcass. Which sounds genius, right? Well, not exactly. I mean, in a lot of ways it was the perfect solution, but whilst it's true that no human would touch it, it didn't have the same effect on street cats. Either after noticing it in testing or in the field, the CIA found that their dead drops were regularly being cat burgled. Dosing the rats in Tabasco sauce or other repellents just didn't work, until the CIA eventually found that wormwood oil did the trick. It's unclear how many times the CIA used this technique, but now that it's declassified, it's probably not even worth checking if any rats you may encounter are secretly carrying messages. But if cats were so good at foiling CIA operations, why not try and use them instead? And this may have been the thought that led to Project Acoustic Kitty, the CIA's attempt to turn cats into spies. Over the 60s, the CIA poured over $20 million into creating listening devices for cats, and training them to go to specific locations and then report back. And the problem of just creating the listening devices cost the CIA so much money, because back in the 60s, bugging devices and microphones were far less advanced. But after years of research and development, the CIA designed a series of implants that could fit under a cat's skin and in its fur. Now theoretically the plan was to release the trained cat, it would go to the target destination, and then it would record and transmit audio back to the agents. This was the plan anyway, but did it go that smoothly? Not really. The first issue was that cats are just so hard to train. They'd rather run off looking for food than follow any agent's instructions. Some sources describe the first attempt in the field was to record the conversation of two men outside the Soviet embassy, and it did go well at first. The cat followed the instructions to the letter, right up until it got spooked, ran into the street, and got hit by a car, causing the CIA to lose both the devices and all of the training, as well as their loyal companion. And that's why in a heavily redacted declassified memo from 1967, the CIA revealed that whilst they managed to get consistent results from training the cats, the project was eventually abandoned. One animal-based project that did work though was the CIA's use of pigeons and other birds as aerial spies. In 1977, satellite spy technology was still relatively primitive, and spy planes were still incredibly risky. They could get spotted or even shot down, causing a massive political incident. One spy plane shot down by the Soviet Union in the run-up to the Cuban Missile Crisis was one of the key reasons that brought the world to a global nuclear crisis. So the CIA improvised and found a new use for pigeons, who had last seen action in the First World War as message carriers. The idea was that by attaching cameras to the pigeons, operatives could carry out almost unnoticeable aerial photos from an incredibly low distance. Agents would then release the trained birds from a hidden compartment in a VW Beetle, then just wait for them to fly over the target and come back. The pigeons could get incredibly detailed pictures of military targets without ever arousing suspicion, and surprisingly this actually worked. When they tested them on US bases, the pigeons were taking better pictures than the most advanced spy satellites. Unfortunately, the declassified files about the project ended shortly after the successful tests, and the CIA has stated that some parts of the program are still classified, implying that the pigeons worked and saw use in the field, but to what extent we don't even know. Lots of the CIA's more wacky ideas revolved around animals, but another dumping ground for their stupidest schemes were based on assassinating Fidel Castro. Most people know about the CIA's vendetta against Castro and the strange methods they tried, like exploding cigars or poisoned scuba gear, but how did this all start? Well, Castro had been on the CIA's radar ever since he deposed their friendly dictator in Cuba and took power himself. By instating a communist revolution in the country, this completely alienated Cuba from America, and after he took power, he had lost a lot of powerful people a lot of money. The mafia in particular were heavily invested in Cuba through a ring of dirty casinos which they had used to launder their money. So when Castro took control, he dissolved the casinos and lost the mob millions in the process. But more particularly was that as Cuba became an ally of Russia and threatened America directly, the CIA had to get involved. And so this is what led to the CIA recruiting two head mafios to whack Castro in 1960, Sam Giancana and Johnny Russilli, two crime bosses on the FBI's top 10 most wanted list, who had an extensive history dominating the criminal underworld. But things just didn't go to plan. First, the mafia presented a man in Cuba's government who had access to Castro, and the CIA gave him poison pills to slip into Castro's food. But after scamming some more money out of the CIA a few times, he backed out. Similar mafia poisoning attempts also failed, as did more traditional methods like gunmen and bombs. And considering their track record in killing heads of state in the 60s, it might just seem like the mafia were just stringing along the CIA the whole time, as they knew the CIA wouldn't be able to do anything against them. So after 2 years of failures and wasted money, the CIA got impatient, and so they tried something drastic. And this is when the Bay of Pigs invasion began, a CIA operation designed to get Castro out and retake control of Cuba. They funded an entire invasion force, but it never got off the beach. Now the details are too long to go into this video, but in short, it failed spectacularly and almost caused nuclear war, so they went back to assassination. In 1963, the CIA planned on killing Castro with exploding seashells. First, they'd embed explosives in a big seashell and then paint it with weird colors and patterns. Then they'd drop it in the sea off the beach that Castro used to frequent. He'd go swimming, see the beautiful seashell, and be unable to resist taking it home. Once he picked it up, boom. Castro's dead, nuclear catastrophe has been averted, and communism fails. Cuba becomes an American ally. However, it's not hard to see why this didn't make it past the planning stage, as if Castro really was just going to pick up objects and bring them home. Another scheme involved a diving suit lined with tuberculosis, but this was also never implemented. One woman hired to kill Castro got closer than all the others. She was given poison pills to slip to Castro concealed in a jar of cold cream. But when she was about to do the deed, she discovered that the pills had dissolved, making them useless. With her plan foiled, she confessed her motives to Castro. Any other dictator would have had her killed, but instead Castro leaned over and gave her his gun, saying, "You can't kill me, nobody can kill me." Then, according to her story, she fell into his arms and they made love before she quickly fled the country. More failed attempts included a pen with a secret poison needle and poisonous powder sprinkled into his shoes. Castro's inner circle estimated that someone tried to kill him 634 separate times, and yet he dodged them all, with Castro eventually dying in 2016 at the age of 90 from old age. While they did fail to kill him, the CIA did consider some alternative solutions to the Cuba problem, and one of their proposed plans, Operation Northwoods, demonstrates their regard for the people they're supposed to defend. Released in the late 90s to the public, one CIA document describes what they call justification for US military intervention in Cuba. Proposed to the Secretary of Defense in 1962, the plan describes a series of false flag attacks across the US. One specific fake incident plan describes taking a plane and modifying it to look like a specific domestic commercial flight with a flight path going over Cuba. Then it would be switched with the real plane, and CIA operatives acting as crew members and passengers would all get on board. The plane would fly normally for a time before submitting a phony distress call and secretly landing at a US military base. In its place, a drone would then fly over Cuba and self-destruct. The US could then blame the plane's disappearance on a Cuban missile attack, giving them justification for a war. Now, this was only ever a plan, but it does make some of the 2001 conspiracy theories a little bit more plausible. Other plans related to Operation Northwoods, they describe actual plans to bomb civilian targets across the US, especially targeting Cuban expatriates and enemies of Castro's regime. Then false evidence would implicate Cuba and incite a war. Another plan involved blowing up a US ship in Cuban waters and then blaming them for the tragic loss of life. They even considered a plan to sabotage John Glenn's mission to become the first American to orbit the Earth. By destroying the nation's hopes, the US government and the CIA could redirect the anger and despair for their own sinister use. The briefing also describes anticipated reactions from the UN and NATO. If they got it right, the report predicts that an image of rash and irresponsible actions by Cuba would develop. It also states that nobody at NATO or the UN should be sent the plans for obvious reasons. And all these plans came from General Lyman Lemitsa and were only stopped at the final step before approval when JFK learned of the operation. After JFK found out about this, Lemitsa was fired from his position as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff shortly after the plan was adopted. and you'd expect that this would be the end of his career. His willingness to actually murder US citizens to justify an unnecessary war should have made him ineligible for command. Instead, he was made Supreme Commander of NATO's forces in Europe from 1962 to 1969. Knowing this, it's really a miracle that the Cold War didn't turn into a hot one. However, Operation Northwoods wasn't the only time that the CIA tried to mislead and manipulate public opinion in their favor. Much more vague but more damning allegations emerged in the 70s that the CIA had been paying off journalists across the world and in the US. It was called Operation Mockingbird, and it involved a massive conspiracy to control information spanning across 25 years. The investigation began with an inspection of a particular wiretapping scheme conducted by the CIA in 1963. 2 US reporters had been tapped to gain information on who their sources were. You see, these 2 reporters had both exposed government secrets to the press, and whilst the CIA couldn't go after the reporters themselves, it didn't mean that they couldn't use them to get the actual whistleblowers within the government. Using the illegal wiretap, the CIA got what they needed, but in doing so, they spied on US citizens without any links to foreign powers. And when this came out, it was referred to as Project Mockingbird, but further details grew into the wider conspiracy on control known as Operation Mockingbird. A report from a special investigation in 1976 alleges that the CIA controlled a network of hundreds of top-level journalists across the world. These journalists would inform the CIA of anything relevant, as well as spread their propaganda for them. It gave the CIA the ability to directly intervene in public opinion whenever they liked. 50 of these journalists, though, were based in America, and they helped sway American public opinion towards the CIA's goals. And they also acted as agents abroad, using their status as an accredited journalist to cover up their connections with the CIA. Now, the CIA officially renounced these tactics after they were made public, but it's very likely that they could still be involved in media manipulation. But whilst the CIA may have relinquished direct control over the media, they weren't afraid of using their power to cover up their crimes and silence whistleblowers. I mean, that was the fate of Gary Webb, a journalist who used to work for the San Jose Mercury News. In his time at the paper, he reported on corrupt officials and organizations, spreading light on shady deals and missing funds. And he was one of the best reporters around, winning a Pulitzer Prize for his exposés. But the story of a lifetime came in 1995, when he uncovered evidence that the CIA had not only been aware that they were funding and working with cocaine traffickers, but the CIA were actively protecting them. In an incredibly detailed, controversial report called Dark Alliance, he exposed the CIA's crimes to the world. The only problem was that nobody believed him. In a malicious and directed campaign, Webb was made to seem like a conspiracy theorist. He was discredited and pilloried by newspapers. Everyone saw him as a crazy tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist, which was all part of the CIA's, quote, productive relationships with journalists. Webb was then unceremoniously fired from his job with his reputation left in tatters. Forced out of his career, Gary Webb seemingly took his own life. Although this does seem very suspicious, because 2 years after Webb's report was released, it came out that the majority of it was actually true. His critics had overblown issues within his report and used them to discredit him. But the core claim of his report, the fact that the CIA were turning a blind eye to drug trafficking, was completely true. Just like MKUltra, the story begins with the existential fear of communism. The CIA was desperate to make sure that the US could maintain control of Central and South America. Firstly, they had major economic interests. The US and its neo-colonial fruit companies used Latin America as a source of cheap labor. In some cases, they owned half of the country's land, extracting billions of dollars from the people of these countries, and a communist regime would threaten all of this, as well as giving Russia direct access towards America, as this was another battleground in the Cold War. And so America was always going to be willing to support anyone who would fight the communists. It didn't matter how brutal of a dictator you were, or what your past crimes had been. If you were fighting communism, you could expect an almost unlimited supply of money and guns. And it's in this way that the US overthrew the democratically elected government of Guatemala in 1954, replacing it with a friendly authoritarian dictator, happy to exploit his country for a cut of the profits. A similar thing happened in Bolivia, Panama, Chile, the list just goes on. But it was in Nicaragua where Webb found his story. There, the CIA had been funding Contra rebels, a military force with dictatorship ambitions and a hatred for communism. They will funnel guns and money by the CIA and the US government. Reagan even called these people freedom fighters in a campaign speech, despite their terror tactics. However, Webb revealed that the Contras, in an effort to secure more funds for their rebellion, were actually trafficking cocaine. He linked them to Freeway Rick Ross and 2 other infamous Californian drug lords. These were some of the men responsible for the crack epidemic that swept across America in the 80s. The epidemic that ripped apart families, put hundreds of thousands behind bars, and killed countless thousands of people. Now, the CIA would later admit that 2 of the 3 men did have personal connections with the Contras, and that major narcotic deals had taken place between them. He even showed evidence that the CIA had actually been aware of this. Both claims were later backed up by a CIA report, but Webb Webb's work is just one piece of the puzzle. Both the wars against the communists and the then drug war introduced a massive amount of guns into the region. They started these wars without any clear goals, and they inevitably broke down in a perpetual battle for control between splintered factions. And when countries become more destabilized, this means more poverty and destitution for their people, which then creates more soldiers for the drug cartels. It's a never-ending cycle that's led to the drug war that we see today. And the more destabilized it becomes in the rest of the Americas, the more drugs then get trafficked to the West. And this wasn't just the CIA catalyzing the crack epidemic, this was also happening in Afghanistan, where when the American government entered Afghanistan, opium production increased from 10% to 90% in the region. And this is one of the furthest reaching legacies of the CIA and their tampering in other countries. And it might seem like this is all history, because of how long it takes documents to get declassified and revealed to the public, as we still don't know much about the CIA's most recent activities, but what we do know clearly shows that they still have the same disregard for human life and the law. But one of the most recent crazy CIA operations was their plot to assassinate Julian Assange.
The US had plans to abduct or even assassinate Julian Assange.
Conspiracy to kidnap and murder an Australian citizen and an award-winning journalist and editor who has done nothing but publish truthful information about the United States and about war crimes, human rights abuse and corruption the world over.
In 2017, officials at the highest levels of US government were plotting his demise. And this wasn't just an idea. Specific plans were suggested, diagrammed, and ran through various committees before they reached the top, with the scheme even being given the green light by top officials, with months of planning going into the hit. Now, it started in early 2017 when Mike Pompeo took the stand in Washington to give his first speech as director, but instead of talking about the future or his plans for the CIA in general, he focused on WikiLeaks.
WikiLeaks walks like a hostile intelligence service and talks like a hostile intelligence service.
In his first chance to speak publicly in his new position of power, Pompeo chose to call WikiLeaks a quote, non-state hostile intelligence service, often abetted by state actors like Russia. This came as a shock, because for years prior, the US and the CIA had always considered Assange a journalist. So what caused this giant pivot? And why was the CIA's biggest enemy now Julian Assange? Well, this was because WikiLeaks had published their most embarrassing leak to date, publishing a trove of classified documents called Vault 7 in early 2017.
Exposed the CIA's most sensitive hacking tools that it used to launch offensive cyber activities around the world. And it was considered at the time the largest data loss in CIA history.
The leaks purportedly show that the CIA is capable of hacking smartphones, computer operating systems, automobiles, messenger applications, and even internet-connected televisions.
And these documents exposed the CIA's own hacking tools and techniques, which apparently severely compromised their intelligence operations. Along with the humiliation of being hacked and having their secrets exposed to the world, pushed the CIA to consider drastic measures against Assange and WikiLeaks. That's why under the leadership of director Mike Pompeo, who consistently emphasized the threat posed by WikiLeaks, the CIA would begin prioritizing the kidnapping and the subsequent assassination attempt of Assange. A truckload of intelligence updates were regularly sent to President Trump. Next, the CIA would explore other options, like sabotaging WikiLeaks web servers, along with spreading disinformation about WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, and even going so far as to steal computers from them. But the secure, secret nature of WikiLeaks made these plans impractical. It was clear that PSYOPs and intelligence weren't going to change WikiLeaks or Julian Assange, and so the CIA would continually pressure Trump to finally change plans with Assange and give them the chance to crack at him, with the biggest advocate for this change in policy being pushed by Mike Pompeo. And after enough pressure, the government would redefine WikiLeaks as a threat to national security. The CIA had been given the go-ahead. They would finally take down Julian Assange once and for all, with Pompeo even going so far as to say, quote, nothing's off limits, don't self-censor yourself, I'll worry about the lawyers in Washington. The first idea was to kidnap Assange, but this idea was quickly shot down due to the complexities of violating multiple countries' sovereignty. I mean, to get him, they would have to violate 3 countries' sovereignty at once, as Assange was an Australian citizen living in an embassy that was in London, but was technically on Ecuadorian soil. So the CIA would opt for more extreme measures, and this was when the assassination operation began, as leaked conversations in mid-2017 revealed that Trump inquired about the possibility of assassinating Assange and other WikiLeaks members, prompting the CIA to develop options and plans. Legal considerations were raised, but Pompeo and the CIA would push forward, seemingly unconcerned about the legality of their actions, with sources within the CIA going so far as to say that when Pompeo took over the CIA, he cut the lawyers out of a lot of things. I mean, it's unknown whether the CIA's head legal counsel had even heard of this assassination plot when it was being drawn drawn up. But unburdened by questions about legality, Pompeo and the CIA plowed ahead anyway. And time was running out. People were starting to realize the injustices Julian Assange was facing. He was a slave living in the Ecuadorian embassy, completely cut away from his family and normal regular society. And because of this growing public pressure, Sweden would drop their bogus charges against him in May of 2017, and public opinion was vastly in his favor. And that's when the CIA was growing increasingly alarmed. They had to do something fast. And then not long after, the CIA would soon discover intelligence that suggested the Russians were plotting to help Assange escape the embassy and fly him back to Russia. The exact same thing they had already done to Edward Snowden, and the CIA wasn't going to repeat this embarrassment again. And so the CIA, along with the British and Russian intelligence, intensified their planning and surveillance of the embassy. Every major power wanted him, and because of the growing tension, the extremism of these plans burgeoned. I mean, the CIA was actually drawing up plans to engage in a gunfight with Russian agents during their escape attempt, or even crashing a car into Assange's vehicle, or preventing his departure by firing on the tires, to denying airspace to the plane that leaves to Russia, all while Russian agents began practicing escape maneuvers in their cars outside of the embassy, all designed to throw off and confuse anyone watching them. It was so crazy that one former senior official said, quote, "It got to the point where every human being in a 3-block radius was working for one of the intelligence services, whether they were street sweepers or police officers or security guards. All of these agents were surrounding the embassy." And so it was no surprise that Assange and his associates became increasingly paranoid. WikiLeaks was the core of an international conspiracy, which is why Assange believed that all of his conversations were being monitored and being used against them to release more fake, damaging information in the event of their deaths, all to smear WikiLeaks and Assange's name. And he wasn't wrong to be paranoid. The CIA actually had an inside source within the Ecuadorian embassy providing intelligence on Assange's activities, and who was also close to poisoning Assange. The secretive nature of this operation has meant that all precise details remains kind of unclear. However, the leaked information and conversations indicate a concerted effort by the CIA to assassinate Assange, which to put it simply means that the government was willing to break all international law to kill a journalist that said bad things against the US government.